This, from Daniel chapter 9, is, shall we say, the start of the story for the Great Tribulation. And it's a prophecy that was given to Daniel by the angel Gabriel. And let's take a look at what it says here. It says, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. This is a prophecy that is often referred to as Daniel's the 77s, all right? 70 groups of 7, whatever that may mean, all right? So and this is where we're going to see as we work our way through these 77s, where this idea of a 7-year tribulation actually comes from. All right, so just so you know, what I just read to you is from the New International Version, which is more accurate to the actual Greek, in that the Greek does just say 77s. Now, some Bible translations will refer to this as Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, all right? And we'll get to in a minute about what a week means in Hebrew, in Hebrew lingo, so to speak. But in case you ever heard 70 weeks versus 77s, same prophecy. So why don't we do this? We're going to start at the top, and we're going to work our way through this prophecy so you can see how it leads people to believe that there will be a 7-year tribulation period in the future. All right, so here's the very start of it, right? It says 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to do all these things, all right? To seal up vision and to anoint the most holy place. All right, so what is a 7? Well, the reason why a lot of translations translate this as 70 weeks is obviously because, well, how many days are in a week? It's 7, right? 7 days in a week. So one theory is, well, this could be referring to weeks, but is it? We all hear the term weeks and we think of 7 days, right? But in Hebrew culture, you could certainly have a week of days. If you talked about 1 week, that you could be referring to 7 days, but not always. Sometimes you could also be referring to 7 years. There was such a thing in Hebrew culture at the time to speak of weeks of years instead of just weeks of days, or a week of years. And I've got on the screen here a couple examples for you. And this is from Genesis chapter 29, where Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, right? And so Rachel's father, Laban, said, "You work for me for 7 years and you can marry my daughter." Well, of course, he had 2 daughters, right? And so he tricked Jacob. And after Jacob worked for 7 years, then Laban let him marry his daughter Leah, who was older, because the tradition of the time then was you marry the older one before you marry the younger one. But then he said, "Hey, but you work another 7 years for me, and then you can marry Rachel too." God did not condone polygamy. Please understand. A lot of people look at things like this and say, look, God's condoning polygamy. Never says God condoned what Laban did here. Laban did it, all right? Doesn't mean he was right to do it. He was not right to do it. But anyway, look at these verses from Genesis 29. Verse 18 says, "And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter." In verse 27, this is now Laban talking. He says, fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. And he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. So sometimes in Hebrew, a week refers to 7 days. Sometimes it refers to 7 years. And context is what's going to tell you that. If you look at the events that are being described in Daniel's prophecy, it clearly seems to lean towards the 7 years interpretation as opposed to the 7 days, because some of the things he's talking about just aren't going to be done in that quick of a period of time. So, sorry, flipping my page in my notes. So, then what's the next part? The next part is the next question we have to ask is, okay, so we have this period of time where we have a group of 7 sevens to start off with, right, this group of sevens, but when does this period of time begin? Well, we look at the very next verse, Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. It says the starting point for this prophecy is from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So we want to figure out, we know we've got a prophecy that's dealing with a certain number of groups of 7 years and things that are going to happen after certain time periods. So now in order, it's kind of like a treasure map, right? In order to decipher this map, we need the starting point. We need to know where it begins. And he tells us this in verse 25. It starts from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, when is that? All right. There have been essentially 3 different views on what this is referring to. All right. Excuse me. Option number 1 is that what Daniel's talking about here is referring to a decree that was given by King Cyrus in 539 BC. All right. And it was a decree that even after the Israelites had been removed, they've been conquered, but the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, southern kingdom was conquered by the Babylonians, and there was or vice versa, I'm sorry. And there was a rule, King Cyrus, after the Israelites had been in exile for a while, he says, I'm going to let you go back and rebuild your temple in Jerusalem, which was destroyed at the time that the Babylonians had overtaken and conquered the southern kingdom. All right, and that was in 586 BC. So 586 BC, Babylonians come in, destroy Jerusalem, they burn the whole place with fire, they destroy the temple, and they take the Israelites and they haul them off into exile. All right. Then in 539 BC, King Cyrus says, you can go back and rebuild your temple. All right. And this we see in 2 Chronicles, chapter 36, verses 22 and 23, that says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdom of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. So in 539 BC, King Cyrus says you can rebuild the temple. Is this what Daniel's referring to? No. Here's why. Because remember what Daniel said. Daniel's prophecy wasn't just a command, an order to go and rebuild just the temple. It was to rebuild Jerusalem, the city. All right. This was only an order or permission to rebuild the temple and only the temple. So this doesn't line up with what Daniel was prophesying. So the next option then comes a few years later. What happens is after Cyrus gives this permission to go rebuild the temple, a lot of the Israelites try to do it, but they get a lot of resistance. Well, there is no fortified city of Jerusalem anymore. There are still people living in that area, all right, living where it used to be. And they don't like the Jews coming in and trying to build a temple on this area. And so there's a lot of resistance. And because of that resistance, construction actually stops, all right? Then in 519 or 518 BC, sometime around there, we have a new king, King Darius. And King Darius finds King Cyrus's old order saying to rebuild the temple. And he realizes this hasn't been done yet. And so in 519, 518 BC, King Darius says, get her done, right? Go and build the temple. And we see this in Ezra 6:3, let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices and let its foundations be laid. All right. But again, we have the same issue here. This can't be what Daniel's referring to, because this is, again, only authorizing the rebuilding of the temple, not the entire city. So then we get to option number 3. All right. The temple was rebuilt. Yay. The temple got dedicated. There's a lot of happiness, a lot of celebrating. There's also a lot of anxiety because there's no wall around it. There's nothing to protect it. There's no actual fortified city there. And so we have recorded in the book of Ezra an event, we'll get to when it happened in a minute, that's another question, where King Artaxerxes is now king, and King Artaxerxes gives Ezra permission to do with Jerusalem basically whatever Ezra wants. And what does Ezra want? Ezra wants to rebuild the wall. He wants to rebuild the city so that the temple's not just sitting there unprotected. You can see these verses I've got on the screen. King Artaxerxes gives him permission to do that. And if you look at the very last line in there, it says this happened in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. So we have a specific, again, point in time where we can say this is the start of Daniel's prophecy. So now we have a start date if we could only figure out when was the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. And the answer to that really depends on who you talk to, all right? There's 2 schools of thought on when the 7th year of King Artaxerxes was, because we have 2 different historical resources that give us 2 different answers to that. There's something called the Canon of Ptolemy, all right? The Canon of Ptolemy was a dated list of kings that was used by astronomers as a convenient way to date their astronomical observations, all right? That they could organize what they saw in the sky based upon who was king at that time when they saw it, all right? And if you use the Canon of Ptolemy, then you figure out the 7th year of Artaxerxes is going to fall around 444 BC. However, there is a Greek historian by the name of, I'm going to butcher this, all right, Thucydides, that's what we're going to go with, Thucydides, all right, Thucydides, all right. Well, he records, based upon his history of King Artaxerxes, according to what he says, the 7th year of King Artaxerxes would actually be 454 BC, all right? So we got a 10-year difference between these 2 sources. But what I want to do is I want to show you what happens, because we really can't, I don't think based on that alone, definitively say one way or the other. Was it 444, 454? So we know that the command that starts Daniel's prophecy was either in 444 BC or 454 BC. Let me show you what happens if we use 454. All right, so let me show you what happens. So again, we get back to Daniel's prophecy and looking at verses 25 and 26, this is where we have the rule of these 7s. And what he says is this: there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. All right, so he's got these 2 groups of 7 years, right? The first one, 7 sevens. It's a period of 49 years, right? And then there will be 62 sevens, all right, which is another 434 years. So we have a 49-year period and a 434-year period being described, all right? And what he says here is after the 62 sevens, so if you add those all up, it's a total of 483 years. So after the order to rebuild Jerusalem goes out, 483 years go by, and what's going to happen? The anointed one will be put to death. Who's the anointed one? Anointed one is just another way of translating Messiah. All right, same word, same thing. That's what Messiah means, the anointed one. So Daniel is saying in his prophecy that once the order goes out to rebuild Jerusalem, that over that first 49-year period, it's going to get rebuilt. That happened, all right? And then after 483 years from that order, the Messiah is going to be killed. If you take that starting date to be 454 BC and you go 483 years in the future, guess where you end up? 30 AD. You know what happened in 30 AD, according to many scholars? Jesus was crucified. All right, Jesus was crucified. So if we take this to mean 77s, meaning 7 years each, we have 69 of them up until the Messiah is crucified, which lines up perfectly with Jesus' crucifixion. And skeptical scholars, skeptics, whatever, cannot claim this was changed after the fact to fit with what happened to Jesus. Understand this, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually have copies of this prophecy that predate Jesus' birth. In other words, we have physical copies that are older than Jesus' human incarnation, all right? So we know for a fact that this prophecy existed as it is written before Jesus was born. So you cannot say that Christians came back and changed it after the fact. That's not an option that the evidence allows you to have. All right. So, but that's 69 of the 70, right? We said there were 77s in there. We've accounted for 69 of them. So the first 69 sevens bring us up to the crucifixion of Jesus and point out the crucifixion of Jesus. Then what does Daniel say is going to happen? Then he says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. We just talked about that. That's referring to the crucifixion. The people of the ruler who will come the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The city of Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD, all right, after Jesus' crucifixion. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He, we'll get to who that he is referring to in a minute, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. All right. So take a look at these verses. All right. What you see here is you have a series of 69 sevens that are sequential, that come one right after the other. Then, according to those who believe in a literal 7-year tribulation, you have a gap in time. How do we know we have a gap in time between the 69th week and the 70th week? Well, because this is describing events that happen in between them. If you'll notice there in verse 26, what does it start out with? It says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed will be put to death and will have nothing. And then it goes on to say, and also the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's, again, something else that's going to happen after the 62 sevens, all right? The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end. Desolation has been decreed. Then we get to verse 27. And verse 27 is basically after all these other things have happened, this person, he, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. So our final group of 7 years, according to this interpretation, comes sometime after a delay. How long of a delay? It doesn't say. It could be a week. It could be 2,000 years. All right. It doesn't say. But there's a gap between the 69th 7 and the 70th 7 that were included in Daniel's prophecy. And that's why. Now, a preterist, all right, remember, preterists are people who think this is all fulfilled in the past, all right? They would look at this passage and they would say that there is no gap between the 69th and the 70th 7 in Daniel's prophecy, because they don't believe that these 77s are meant to be taken as literal 7-year periods, all right? They look at the number 7 as being the number of perfection, and it is used a number of times in Scripture to refer to perfection, to things that are perfect, perfectly created by God. And so this prophecy, by referring to 77s, it's just talking about God's perfect timing. Basically, this is all going to happen in God's perfect timing. And so, well, yes, if we're talking about a larger group of 7s versus a smaller group of 7s, we're probably talking about a longer period of time versus a shorter period of time. Preterists would say we shouldn't take that to mean a literal 49-year period or 683-year period or 580 or whatever. I'm sorry. But you get my point, that we shouldn't be a literal calculation, so to speak. It's just referring to God's perfect timing. All right. And so they will look at these things and say this is all referring to events that happened, again, prior to 70 AD. I'm not going to go too much more into that because, well, it's already 706 and we still haven't actually gotten to the tribulation itself, have we? But those who believe that this is in fact referring to there is a gap in time would say that 70th seven prophecy by Daniel, that's the Great Tribulation. That's what it's talking about, is that there was these 69 sevens that lead us up till Jesus' crucifixion. Then there's a gap in time. And then what else was shown to Daniel was another group of 7 years, well off into the future. That is this Great Tribulation period that's coming at the end of time. And they say that this is the same thing that Jesus was referring to in Matthew 24, verse 21, when Jesus, in part of the Olivet Discourse, is talking about, again, what many scholars think is the end times. He says, "For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again." So again, according to futurists, they'll say, this is the Great Tribulation. We agree that, yeah, people will experience tribulation throughout time, but there's going to be this special 7-year period where the tribulation is going to be so great, it's going to be unlike anything else. All right, so that's where this idea of a 7-year tribulation period comes from. It comes from Daniel's prophecy. But then the question becomes, when does the 7 years begin? When do we know that we're in this 7-year tribulation period? Daniel gave us that too. He said, he will confirm a covenant for many for 1 7. Well, that pronoun he, grammatically speaking, can refer to two different people here in this prophecy. It could refer to the Messiah, the anointed one that's up there. It could also refer to the ruler who will come. And so, well, whereas preterists might say this refers to the Messiah, and the reason why sacrifice was put to an end was because, well, Jesus died on the cross and he fulfilled the Old Testament law. There didn't need to be any more sacrifice anymore. A futurist will look at that pronoun he and say, no, that's referring to the people of the ruler who will come. And so they'll agree that the destruction of the city and the sanctuary is referring to the destruction of Rome and the temple that the Roman Empire did in 70 AD. And so whoever is going to confirm this covenant with many in the future must somehow be tied to that. And so they basically say, hey, look, because Rome was the leader of Europe at the time, then what this is saying is that there's going to be somebody who's going to be a very powerful European leader who's going to reach a deal, a covenant with Israel at some point in the future for 7 years. It's going to specifically be a covenant for 7 years. So when we see a European leader reach a 7-year covenant with the nation of Israel for a 7-year period, all right, then that will tell us the tribulation's about to begin, according to this futurist viewpoint. Again, this is just one view out of several in how we interpret this, this actual passage.